Hello, everyone, and welcome. We've had 110 people from all around the world registered for the class. I think it's 13 countries, counting the USA, where we are. And so we have brothers and sisters from all different cultures and places and time zones. So I'm really happy that we can be together and talk a little bit about Tibetan. We teach the classical language of Tibetan. That's the language of Buddhism in Tibet. So all the texts and the teachings, this is the language that we teach, and that includes the Bön tradition as well. So I'm quite delighted we can be here together and do this. It's kind of a miracle, isn't it, that we can come together via Zoom and share like this. So as Bento mentioned, there's probably among the people who have registered, some people are brand new to the language and don't know anything about it at all. And other people are quite experienced with it. So I'm going to try to provide something interesting for everyone. And the people that are very beginners, it might be like, well, a couple of times I've sat in on master classes on things like the violin and piano and dance, and I wasn't really a student of those things at all, but I always learned something, and I hope the same will be true for you. I hope it'll be both fun and interesting, and maybe even a bit inspiring as we look at this beautiful language and this wonderful text that we're going to study a bit today. So we're going to study a verse from a very important text, a text that's famous throughout Tibet. All the schools of Buddhism study it, and now it's become famous around the world as well as Tibetan Buddhism has spread around. And that's the text is the 37 Practices of the Bodhisattva, and it was written hundreds of years ago by a great a man who was a great scholar, but also a very spiritual being, a very advanced spiritual being who had tremendous compassion. Gyaltse Tokme is his name. Gyaltse just means Bodhisattva, by the way. That's the Tibetan word for Bodhisattva. So Gyaltse Tokme is his name. He was so compassionate that it really, he influenced many, many people. He had a very famous friend who was ill, had an ongoing illness, and his friend asked him just to bless him. And because he was so compassionate, that if you bless me, he said, maybe I'll be cured. And that did happen, actually did cure him. And Gyaltse Tokme traveled, he had a traveling companion when he wandered around as a yogi and itinerant teacher. And that traveling companion was a wolf. And the wolf became very tame just being with Gyaltse Tokme. In fact, he became a vegetarian, it said. So anyway, he had an influence on lots of people during his lifetime. And now, hundreds of years later, he's still influencing people all around the world. So it's a little verse from his famous teaching called the 37 Practices of the Bodhisattva that we're going to look at today. So the 37 Practices of the Bodhisattva, it's part of a genre of sacred texts from Tibet that have to do with the subject of mind training, which is called Lojong. Some of you know Lojong mind training. So it's been said that there's a very short version of the primal text on Dzogchen that's very short, and that's called the 8 Verses of Mind Training. And then there's the medium length one, which is our book, the 37 Practices. And then the long one is Shanti Deva's Bodhicharyavatara in Sanskrit, but engaging in the practice of the Bodhisattva. So this is the genre in which our text fits, belongs. So it's a Mahayana text, and it actually has all 3 different levels of Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana encoded in it, you could say. And then it's a poem, and so it's very easy for Tibetan people to memorize. Okay, so it's from the 14th century, and so now, so it's 700 years old, I guess. So we're going to look at one particular verse, which is verse 11. And this is the part of the book where he starts the teaching on what we call relative bodhicitta or bodhicitta. And bodhicitta is a word that means heart of awakening. So it's about the individual person committing herself to becoming fully realized, fully liberated, fully enlightened herself, but for the benefit of all beings. So that's where our verse fits in. So I thought I would just read, well, before I want to read the verse to get us started. Before I do, I'll just talk about the text that we prepared. So the text is just prepared kind of in a landscape format rather than the usual, whatever the other is called. And so if you print it out, if you can print it out, then it should print out such that this page, the 37 practices, where it says that, and then it says line 1. And if you print it out double-sided, then it will flip sideways like this, rather than left to right. It will flip kind of top to bottom, and then you'll have line 2 on the back of that same piece of paper. And then the next would be the same with lines 2 and 3, or 3 and 4 rather. So on 2 pieces of paper, you'd have the 4 lines. And then the last page is what we call the translation worksheet. So it's the 4 lines of Tibetan, and then down at the bottom, the translation. And so this is where you can take notes if you like. So how I would do it is I would have that, since I'm right-handed, you might be left-handed, but I'd have that page off to the right, so I can take notes on it. And then off to the left, the other pages, one by one. Okay, so that's our text, the form that we've printed out. So I hope that works for you. And that wasn't confusing what I just said. And so so we have very little time, so I don't want to rush too much, but I want to keep going. And there's lots of things I would like to share with you and talk about, but we don't have time for. So we're going to jump right into the Tibetan. And as a segue into that, I'll read the translation of the verse. So it's the 37 Practices of the Bodhisattva by Gyaltse Tilkme from the 14th century. And this is verse 11. And it says, all suffering without exception comes about from the desire for one's own happiness. Perfect Buddhas arise from considering the welfare of others. Therefore, to perfectly exchange one's own happiness for the suffering of others is the practice of a bodhisattva. One thing about this is actually regarded as a very advanced practice, this mind training and called Lojong in Tibetan. And one of the key things about it is you exchange your own well-being, you give that away to other people and then take on their suffering. So that's a pretty advanced thing to do, actually. Okay, well, let's now take a look at the Tibetan. Let's jump right in and look at the Tibetan. So the form that we have here in the 4 lines, that's which is displayed on the screen there. This form is called the shloka, S-H-L-O-K-A, shloka. That's a Sanskrit word. And in the Tibetan, so it referred to a certain kind of stanza in Tibetan, in Sanskrit rather, in India, but then the Tibetans made it their own, just like they translated the entire Buddhist canon from Sanskrit and other languages into their own language. So they made it their own. And so what it refers to in Tibetan, and what we have here, this shloka form, and by the way, this is the form, if you're a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, you might do sadhanas. I believe every single sadhana I've seen, and so I'm pretty comfortable in saying thousands of sadhanas are written in this form. And then other things too, like when the Tibetans translated the Shantideva's text, engaging in the practice of the Bodhisattva or the way of the Bodhisattva, they translated it into shlokas like this. And the same with, hundreds of texts, like, for example, at the Tibetan Language Institute, TLI, one of my senior students and I are reading Aryadeva's 400 verses on the middle way. That is, translated into shlokas. The 37 practices itself, of course, but many texts are. It's really a standard form, and so what it is it's a stanza of 4 lines. And sometimes the whole thing is called a verse, and sometimes each line is called a verse, and I talk of it like that usually. But in any case, it's 4 lines, and then the first 2 lines very often go together, and the lines, so lines 1 and 2, and then lines 3 and 4, and then they make a whole, so like part A and part B. And then, so it's always going to be 4 lines, and then each sloka will have the same number of syllables per line, and that's how the meter works. It's syllabic. And so our particular text has the 4 lines, and then each of them has 9 syllables per line. Usually you see 7 or 9. Every now and then you see something more, something different, a little bit different. Like a lot of people do the Green Tara sadhana. There's a part in there, the 21 phrases, that's 8 syllables per line, highly unusual, but almost all of them have this form. So when we learn it in one text, like the 37 practices, then what we learned there about the poetic form can apply to thousands of texts. Okay, so then the way we approach it to study a shloka in Tibetan is we take it line by line, and then we begin by spelling the line in toto. We spell out the whole line in Tibetan, and then we read it out in Tibetan slowly, and then we go back and parse it syllable by syllable. Now that word parse is a strange word, and so P-A-R-S-E in English, parse, what that means is then we determine what the grammatical function and the vocabulary means of each syllable the best we can. And sometimes there's a lot of mystery, and a lot of syllables can mean a lot of different things, and then you put them together, they can mean something different as well. So in English, for instance, when I was a kid, people would say, let's book, and sometimes that would mean to go, but still you can book a flight on an airplane, right? You can book a flight. So book can be a verb, and then and of course it can be a noun, and then sometimes it can be an adjective like bookstore. So the same word book can have several different meanings and be several different parts of speech. And so then how it's meant to be used depends on the context. So we always have to examine the context closely too. And then often there still remains a great deal of mystery. We're going to be teaching a class next month on the 3 principal aspects of the path, a famous text by Tsongkhapa. And the text is beautifully written, but it's written on a very high level of language. It's very literary. It's an erudite text. And so it takes some consulting of commentaries and maybe with teachers, if you have the good fortune and whatnot, to be able to understand what's going on sometimes in it. So that's often at play too. But we'll put all that aside and just kind of go into it and see what we can discover and learn about Tibetan at the same time we're learning about the Buddhist teachings. And in this text, so now that we're in the place in the text again, where it's talking about what I call the heart of awakening. And that's that impetus, that aspiration to become liberated, realized, enlightened oneself, but for the benefit of all beings. And we don't just stop with other people when we talk about all beings, but we expand that to all of life, the whole planet. Okay, so I think it's very much a teaching for the times. But here we go then, line 1. And so I apologize for the people that don't know how to spell. And for the people that know a lot, I apologize for going too slowly, but I'm going to try to go a middle way to try to help as many people as possible here. So spelling out the Tibetan, then sa, da, da, shub, q, do, ga, duke. So that's one syllable and it has one dot after it. That's how Tibetan works. It's a monosyllabic language in the sense that each syllable means something or is doing something, and then the syllables are separated by dots. So that was the first syllable. Then the second syllable is ba, o, sa, nata, na, la, nel, ma, la, shub, q, lu, sa, lu, ba, o, da, ga, dak, ba, o, da, drang, bu, de, a, o, da, naro, do, da, de, la, sa, le, ba, yata, ja, shub, q, ju, na, june now. So there I spelled that entire line. Now I'm going to read it out and I'll do it quite slowly, but this would be how it's pronounced, syllable by syllable. Duke, Nell, Ma, Lu, Doc, Day, De, Lay, June. Okay, La. Duke, Nell, Ma, Lu, Doc, Day, De, Lay, June. Okay, now we can look at the parsing table, line 1. Okay, so there's line 1. That's the same line that I just spelled out. And then its translation is right there. So, you know where we're going. So it's generally going to be, say, something like this. About a word about translations, there's no such thing as a definitive translation. The Tibetan is so rich and so nuanced and so many layered that you can't. So every translation is kind of an interpretation. It's kind of a version, but you can't capture the whole thing in translation. We could easily spend the whole day just talking about this line, about the grammar, the vocabulary, the Dharma, and we could have like 10 pages of notes on that. But then we're trying to reduce all of that understanding, which in itself would still just be partial, to one line. So the translation is very provisional, okay? And then so is what I'm going to say about the grammar and the vocab one by one. But we're moving into the neighborhood. You know, it's like when we see a star, right? Perhaps at night, we see a star and we go, oh, that's that star. There it is. It's in the belt of Orion because that's a constellation, right? But then if we look at it with a telescope, and then if we look at it with a bigger telescope, and then we see it from the Hubble telescope, it just keeps going. We just keep learning more and more about it, and it becomes more and more amazing. And it's not just a pinpoint of light in the night, but it is beautiful when you're a child and someone goes, look at that star. Look at that bright star. Isn't it beautiful? And so anyway, studying Tibetan's like that, the more you go, the more beautiful it becomes. Okay, anyway, so then something I didn't say about the verses, they're going to be almost always an odd number of syllables per line, and they're going to break into a pattern of 2 by 2, but the last grouping will be 3. So we have 9, and so you can see we've got 2 syllables together, and then 2, and then 2, and then 3. So that makes 9. 2, 2, 2, 3 times 2 is 6, and then 3 is 9. So then this entire text is going to go in this pattern. It's going to be made up of, it's called the 37 Practices of the Bodhisattva. There's actually 43 verses because he has an intro and an outro, and then the 37. But all of them are going to be in shlokas, and all the lines are going to be 9 syllables. Okay. And so Tibetans love what we call binomials, and that's just 2 noun or 2 word units. So in Tibetan, it becomes more accurate to think of 2 syllable groups. So each little grouping of meaning, very, very often, there will be exceptions. And when it's just like in music or poetry, When someone's creating in a certain format and then you do a little change to it, that's intentional and meaningful, and it has some nuance of meaning and suggestion to it that can be quite sensitive and insightful, but can't always be translated very easily. Okay. It's like any piece of music, right? You can't really explain to another person what that is, right? You can't say why is, Beethoven's Ninth great. And you could write, volumes of books on it, but you can't really capture it, right? That way. Okay. But you can have an experience with it, right? And we can have an experience with Tibetan. And the more experience we have with it, and the more we learn about it, learn about the language. And when studying Tibetan, you also have to be studying the Dharma, the teachings at the same time, and vice versa. The more you know about each, the more you know about the other. And it just becomes like infinitely enriching. Okay. So anyway, this first word is pronounced Duke now, kind of like Duke, like, Duke and Earl, and then now, maybe like a woman's name, but Duke now. Anyway, it's a noun and it means suffering. So it's almost always a noun, but it could be an adjective, for instance. But here, I think we can say it's a noun. Okay. And then the next grouping is Ma Lu, and that's 2 syllables. Now, a syllable can be a bona fide word in Tibetan, or it can be what we call a particle. And particles are words like in English, prefixes and suffixes on words are called particles, and so are prepositions. So in English, we've got the word invisible, right? And then we've got invisibility, right? Well, that word's made up of the Latin root vis, which has to do with vision and seeing, and then in, which is a negation particle in English. We don't think about it like that, but that's what it is. Invisible, and then a bull can make it an adjectival ending. So that's something's invisible. In the daytime, that star is invisible. And then we've got invisibility, but that iti and the in and all that, those are like particles put on the main root, which is a word. Okay, so the same thing happens in Tibetan. So we've got bona fide words and particles. English is a little complex because it borrows the roots of words from Greek and Latin and other places, and then puts the standard stock of prefixes and suffixes, which are the particles, to make up new words. Okay, I saw an example the other day, unwholesomeness. So all these things glued together to make up new words. Tibetan does that very same thing. So ma can be a negation particle, a little particle that comes before something that it negates. And then lu can be a noun or an adjective or a verb, but here it's a verb and it means to leave behind. But this becomes kind of an idiomatic expression, malu, it means nothing left behind or without exception. And so modifiers in Tibetan often come after the noun they modify, and that's what we have going here. So Duknel Malu is suffering without exception. And then you see the way that we translated that was all suffering, right? Suffering without exception. And then I translated, I guess, all suffering without any exception. I'm trying to make it into nice English that conveys, first of all, the meaning of the Tibetan. Okay, the meaning of the Tibetan. And you can't always get both the meaning and the poetry and the nuance. You can't get all of that in a translation, but you try. Okay, so all suffering without exception. Okay, so we just leave that for a moment and continue. Then the next to binomial, the next 2 syllable unit, we see there is dak day. So that's a pronoun plus a noun. So the pronoun dak, ba-o daga dak, that literally means I or me. And it's the word that Tibetans use to translate the Sanskrit concept Atman, self or soul. Okay. And then day means bliss or happiness. Sometimes we see a fuller version of it, de wa. So doc de is like me bliss. Well, we could translate that as my bliss or my happiness. I think he wrote it for us to recite it and take it very personally, because we want to change ourselves by engaging in this study and practice. And we want to become the inherent true being that we are, which is a fully enlightened Buddha. So in the process, then we're going to practice and do something, as Shantideva tells us, that we have to engage in practice of the Bodhisattva. We have to engage in it, right? Not just learn about it. That's why in Tibetan it says engage with it, entering the practice. You're going into doing it yourself. This is a very important concept in reading Tibetan and in practicing well as well. So he actually writes I or me, so my bliss. And then when we translate, sometimes we make it for everybody. And so we make it more general and say one's own happiness. But if you want, you could read it mine, because I'm talking to myself when I do these, when I read like a great teacher's advice to us, we want to take it personal. So sometimes we can think in I and me terms. And that's, I think, why he puts the word doc here. Okay, so my bliss. And then that brings us to the last box, which is the 3-syllable unit. And in Tibetan, this is de, le, jung. Then de is a noun here that means desire or concern. Yeah, it's a common word for desire, de or depa. Okay, and then le is another particle. It's an ablative particle that gives the idea of source. So it's from desire. Okay, and so if we go backwards, at this point, and Tibetan, I should say, is a subject, object, verb language. So the subject comes first, and then the object or the principal qualifier comes in the middle, and the verb comes at the end. Quite different from English. But some of you, I know, speak German and other languages that are comfortable with having the verb at the end. And that's how Tibetan, all the Tibetan type languages, so whether you're talking about Bhutan or Ladakh, and Mongolia too, they all have the verb at the end. Okay, I believe that's true about Mongolia. Okay, the others I know is true. Okay, so then we come to the verb at the end is jung. And jung is a past tense verb, but in Tibetan, the tenses aren't strictly the same as they are in English, but this means it's occurred in the past and it's ongoing now and will be ongoing into the future. So it means arise. And so dule jung means arise from desire. And it could be almost, when desire becomes too strong, it becomes attachment or fixation. But so then, Tibetan is read compared to English in a 1-3-2 kind of fashion. So now we've identified all the parts. Let's take it in a 1-2-3 manner. So the one part is the subject of the sentence, and that's all suffering without any exception. And then we jump to the end for the verb. We leap over the 3 to the 2, and we get arises. And then we come backwards for step 3, all the way back to step 1. And then we get from desire, own happiness. So all suffering without exception comes about or arises from the desire for one's own happiness. That's totally contrary to the ego's way of thinking and doesn't make any sense. So it's like kind of quantum physics compared with Newtonian physics. On an ordinary daily way of thinking, we think time is always the same and space is always the same and gravity is always the same everywhere and all times, right? But now we know, after Einstein, that gravity near, like a major planet or the sun then changes, and time and space change. They're flexible. So this is very helpful in thinking about Tibetan Buddhism too, that there's the ultimate truth and then the relative truth. And so what he's trying to do is take us from being relative, ordinary, ego-fixated, selfish people to being bodhisattvas and thinking with love and compassion and the heart of awakening. Have that imbue our life. That's what this is all about. Let's go on and look at line 2 now. So first we spell it. Ra, zata za, naro zo, ga, sa, zok, pa, agigu I, pe, sa, na, sa, song, ra, gata ga, yata gya, sa, ge, ga oja, na, jen, pa, na, pen, sa, drengbu se, ma, sa, sam, la, sa, le, a, o, ka, ratatra, shabshu, true, na, sa, trun. Okay, that's the spelling. Now I read it. Zok. And new people, you can be writing in the phonetics or the approximate pronunciation as I do this phase. So line 2 is zok. That would be something like D-Z-O-K-E, rhyming with spoke, but with a D-Z, with a D-Z at the beginning. Zok. And then the second syllable is pei, song, gye, zhen, pen, sem, lei, trun. So it's going to go 2, 2, 2, 3 again. So zok pei, song gye, zhen pen, sem lei trun. Yak bodu, that means good. It's good in Tibetan. Okay, spoken Tibetan. Okay, so here we have zokpe. So the last two little ligatures there, which is a little ah and a gigu, those are a genitive particle that connect words together. And the first two syllables, zokpa, that's the word that means perfect or complete. And then when we put that little agigu e on it, it's called a genitive particle. It turns that word complete into an adjective modifying the following word. Okay, so we do this in English. We can take a noun in English like humor, like fun, right? Humor, and make it an adjective by putting a particle on the end. And that particle in English is O-U-S. So humorous. Humor is a noun, humorous is an adjective. That was a humorous story, right? Okay, that story's filled with humor, difference between a noun and an adjective. Okay, so this little genitive particle is connecting zokpa, which then becomes pronounced zokpe, and then it turns from a noun into an adjective like completion, or could just be complete also, or perfect. And then it's modifying the next word, which is song gye. And song gye is the Tibetan word for Buddha. And it means much more than Buddha does. Song can mean to be perfected, or it can mean to be awakened or purified. And then gay can mean expanded, blossomed, developed. So what it means is when we look at ourselves, we see that we have two aspects. And one is our inherent, beautiful Buddha nature endowed with qualities such as love and compassion and wisdom and joy and bliss and kindness and creativity, all of that. And so those things we want to expand and blossom and bring to fruition. That's the gay, the second syllable. But then we also have like greed and anger and delusion and jealousy and laziness and things like that. So those want to be purified. So the Tibetan word sangye then means all of that. It means to have purified and on one hand, and then gay, blossomed and perfected the good qualities. All that's together in the word that we just say Buddha. So that's one of the reasons we study Tibetan, and that's kind of a wow experience for some of us. So now when someone says, if you tell someone you're a Buddha and they say, what's that? You could say, well, you're someone that's interested in both purifying away and constantly working on yourself to perfect yourself, to purify the limiting factors and the bad qualities. And on the other hand, to perfect the beautiful qualities that we all have in an infinite degree within, to bring those out, make those flower. That's basically what a Buddha is. And then a Buddhist is someone that's engaged in that process. And so now we have perfect Buddhas. Oh, That's someone that's completed entirely the task of the spiritual life. So these perfect Buddhas, now that's what he's going to talk about in this line. So we talked about kind of ego stuff in the last line, right? All suffering coming about from fixating on my own happiness, and that's what I care about, that orientation. Now in this next line, he's flipping it, and he's saying perfect Buddhas. Zhen Pen. Zhen means others, and Pen means benefit in the next box. Zhen Pen, other benefit, basically. Okay, so benefit can be a verb or a noun again, and Zhen means others, like everybody else besides that ego person, right? Okay, and then the next box, Sem Le Trung. Sem means mind. Zhangchu Sem Pa is a bodhisattva, by the way, but Sem means mind, and Le is the from particle again. So from mind, and then Trung is a verb that means to arise also, just like the Jung in the same place and the previous line meant to arise. That was an ordinary word, speaking in the ordinary register, humilific, it's sometimes called, and this is an honorific. So this is something that doesn't translate into English. They have different registers of the same idea. The same verb is to rise up, like the sun or whatever, or to rise up out of samsara, or just to come about, to be born. So, but this one's honorific. So he's saying perfect Buddhas. So when we're talking about perfect Buddhas in the beginning as the subject, it makes sense, right? That he's going to talk about, that he's going to use an honorific verb. So this is part of the subtlety and beauty in the Tibetan, that can't really be translated. You can't say, well, he non-honorifically, all suffering non-honorifically arises, from selfishness. And then our true Buddha-ness, that's our true identity, that honorifically arises. You can't talk like that in English. It doesn't make sense. But that's in the Tibetan. That's the meaning of it. Okay, so we've got an ordinary line and then an honorific line. So again, all suffering without exception comes about from desiring one's own happiness. That's ordinary that's samsara, if you will. This is nirvana, perfect Buddhas, and that's you, that's our true identity. That comes about from this concern or considering or the thought to help others, considering the welfare of others. Okay, so that's the first part. Let's go on to line 3. So line 3, then we'll spell it out. And then if you've been able to catch a lot of that, what we said about line 1 and line 2 so far, we'll see that line 3 has a whole bunch of vocabulary from each of those lines and puts them together in one line. So if you're learning the Tibetan and you study line 1 thoroughly, you learn that vocab, right? Lines 1 and 2. And you learn that Duk now means suffering, for instance, and Dak means I, and Zhen means other. You've learned that. And then when you come to line 3, it gets easier. And this is one of the things that the great writers do. They introduce certain vocabulary that really can't be translated or noticed so easily in English or some other translation. But in the Tibetan, they're using a certain set of vocabulary, and then they repeat that in a little bit different context. But then that resonates with you because you understood it from before, and now here it comes again in a little slightly different way. I think people that know music way better than I do, which doesn't take much, can see a similar type of thing in the composition of music. There's certain things that are played, and then maybe the next time they're played with different instruments maybe, or they're done a little bit differently, but there's a resonance there. Same thing we have here in line 3. So we spell Dadring Bu De, Payata Chagi Gu Chi Ra Chir, Bao Da Ga Dag, Bao Da Dring Bu De, Gao Ja Na Zhen, Gayata Gyagi Gu Gi, Sadata Da Shab Q Du Ga Duk, Bao Sang Nata Na La Nel, Da Ga Dak. That was the spelling, then the reading. Day, cheer, Doc, Day, Zhen, Gi, Duke, Nell, Doc. Again, it's going to go 2, 2, 2, 3. So Day Cheer, Doc Day, Zhengi, Duke Nell Doc. Okay, let's look at the first box. Day Cheer means therefore. It's literally that because, or because of that. So therefore, so now he's explained these two things. This is samsara, where we are. This is nirvana, where we want to get to. So therefore, let's do something about that, right? So Buddhism is very practical. People that don't know Buddhism might think that it's all abstract philosophy or whatever, but it's exceedingly practical. And that's one of the great things about the really realized masters. Many of them were also great poets, great philosophers, great writers in general, and then greatly compassionate. So they've been there, Martin Luther King said, I've seen the promised land. They've had realization experience, and now they realize that all of us are suffering. So they want to show us the way, right? Show us the light and how we can blossom ourselves and have, first of all, that experience ourselves. So first we study, and then we reflect, and we do some kind of practice and contemplate and try to bring it into the way that we live. And as we engage in that, all of a sudden, these little glimpses of experience start happening. And then we follow up with that, remembering to follow. Merrill Peterson, great translator, uses that theme a lot. Remembering to follow up on the teachings leads to experience. Follow up on that experience leads to realization. Realization leads to liberation from all this suffering and to a lot more, to full Buddhahood. So this one verse, 37:11, the whole path of Buddhism is in here. Okay, so therefore, and then now we have Doc Day. That's the same thing we had in line 1, self-bliss. Concerned with my own happiness. Okay, so therefore, I'm going to do something with it now. That self-concern, you could call that self. It's literally self-bliss or my happiness. Okay, and then Zhen Gi is the next one. Zhen means self or other again, and then Gi is another word that means of. And then we go on, and we find Duke, next box. Duke Nell is suffering again, and then Doc is a pluralizing particle, like adding an S on a word in English, so suffering becomes sufferings. Okay, and then this one will read straight backwards, or it could. Well, therefore, at the beginning, therefore, the suffering of others' own bliss. So something's going on with my own bliss, and then the suffering of others that we've talked about. Okay, so then what are we going to do with that? So the main verb in Tibetan comes at the end of the 4th line of the stanza, the shloka. So let's go to line 4. And we spell that. Yana yang. This thing that we're doing here, and the way that the shloka is structured, you can apply this to tens of thousands of shlokas in Tibetan, in your sadhanas. Even if a book is a prose text, like the Jewel Ornament of Liberation, or the Words of My Perfect Teacher, or the Lam Rim text, Tsongkhapa's great Lam Rim, and all his different versions of that. All of those are written in the same form, by the way, all those texts that I just, but even if they're mainly written in prose, then they quote the sutras and the shastras and other books, and that's in shlokas. So it's everywhere. And then the shloka has this form always. So I've had the good fortune to read thousands of them now. And so I'm starting to get a little bit familiar with them. I regard myself as some kind of advanced beginner, maybe. It starts to then, you just start to recognize more and more subtleties and beauties about it, and profundities. And then it really works on your mind. If you're that type of person that I'm doing this Buddhist stuff because I want to change, because I want to achieve liberation for myself, and then you get a little bit more advanced, and and for other people too, and for everybody, and stop this suffering in the world, then this really starts to speak to your heart. It starts to resonate with your deep heart's core. Okay, line 4, spelling. So I get very excited about it. Sorry if I'm being too enthusiastic. Ya, na, yang, da, ga, dak, ba o ra, jata ja, drengbu je, wa, ra, gata ga, yata gya, la, gyal, sa, rata sa, say, la, ga, lak, la, drengbu le, na, len, ya, gigu yi, na, yen. That was a spelling. Now the reading. Yang, dak, jay, wa, gyal, say, lak, len, yen. Yang, dak, jay, wa, gyal, say, lak, len, yen. Okay. One of the cool things about the 37 practices, there might be a couple of exceptions, but almost all 37 lines, 37 stanzas, the 4th line can be a complete sentence and teaching and thought in itself. Okay. And that's the case here. Okay. So, Yongdok is kind of an idiom. It's a little idiom, and it means authentic, but it can mean perfect or excellent or complete. But then if a Tibetan word that's an adjective like that, like complete, comes right before a verb, it can be an adverb modifying the verb, kind of like in English. In colloquial language, you can say, she ran quick, but properly it's quickly, an adverb modifying the verb. So she quickly ran, to rescue the child or something like that. She quickly ran. So that's what quickly is an adverb. Quick is an adjective. In English, you put the ly on it, and that makes it an adverb. And so that's the difference between an adjective and an adverb. And so, and by context, if you're reading a novel that's written in a colloquial style, the way that people actually speak, people don't always speak in proper grammar, right? Using proper grammar. So he just didn't. And so you could say, use adjectives where proper grammar would call for adverbs. And so in Tibetan, the context sometimes dictates what part of speech the word is, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. So this is an example. So Yangdag Jewa, next box, Jewa is the verb to exchange. So people that know Lojong, that know the mind training teachings, now you see here how he's moving into direct teaching on mind training. So he's saying to perfectly exchange, to authentically exchange. And then the next box, Gelse, remember that's, people call him Gelse. Gelse is the Tibetan, one of the Tibetan words for Bodhisattva. Chongchub Sempa is one, but Gelse is another. And if we break Gelse down, Gel literally means victor, to be victorious. So it can be the victorious one. A Gel Mo, by the way, is a victorious woman, and that's a queen. And a Gelpo is a king, and a Gelwa is just a victor in general. So Gel here is short for Gelwan. It means victor in general, and that's what we call the Buddha, because he's been victorious in this game of life that we're playing. He's realized what's at stake, and then he set about to accomplish it, and he did accomplish it. So he's the victor. And then say is a word that means offspring. So it can mean child, but, we could talk about someone being 89 years old, and she's the daughter of somebody else, right? And so she's their offspring, right? But we wouldn't say she's a child at 89, right? So when people translate this like child of the Buddha, or child of the victor. Child isn't quite right, is it? It's kind of right, but not quite. And then some people say heir because they don't want to call the bodhisattvas kids, children, excuse me. And so they say heirs, and then other people say, well, you can't call them an heir because they didn't inherit anything from the Buddha. And I would say, yes, they did. They inherited the spiritual teachings from the Buddha. And so then I would join my friend Richard Barron and then say spiritual heir, if you want to translate Bodhisattva into English. But then I would also say Bodhisattva is in the Oxford English Dictionary as an English word now. So there's nothing wrong with saying Bodhisattva. Also, some of my friends like Craig Preston, great translator and teacher of Tibetan and scholar, doesn't like to use any Sanskrit words when he translates because he says we're translating into English, not into Sanskrit. And that's a good point, generally speaking. But I think some words like karma and bodhisattva, we can translate, we can leave them in the Sanskrit and that they originally came from. And the Tibetans called them gyaltse, but see how powerful the Tibetan is. If you, I think it's poetic and powerful and creative what they did. Gyaltse, offspring of the victor. Okay, so bodhisattva, if you will. Okay, so then to completely exchange, and then bodhisattva, and then the last is the verb. And so very often we have a three-part verb in Tibetan. This is an odd example of that, but it is the three-part section at the end of the line, and it is the verb. But it's kind of, here, I think I would back away from what I just said. You can erase that last part. And just the yin at the end is the verb here. So very, very often we have a three-part verb, but we don't here. So I'm changing what I just said a moment ago. We don't here have a three-part verb. We do have the three syllables together that make the poetic for the meter, the last, make them a unit. But lok len is a cool word because lok means hand, ordinary word for hand, and len means take. So lok len is the Tibetan word that we translate. See, it's a poetic, metaphorical word in Tibetan, and then it means take it in hand. But that becomes a noun, practice. In English, we might say take to heart. It's something you take to heart. And so these teachings we're going to take to heart, we're going to actually do them. And the way that Tibetan says that is they're a loklan, they're a taken hand. You know, so it's like you're walking by in the grocery store and you see some great avocados and you don't go, nice avocados, and keep going. No, you take it in hand, right? You stop and grab it, you know, take it. And that's what practice means, to take in hand. So then practice is right next to bodhisattva. So in English, we could say bodhisattva practice. And then yin is the verb is. And so here, to exchange perfectly is the practice of the bodhisattva. Oh, let's look at line 3 again for a moment. Therefore, so line 3 and 4, remember I said they go together to make a unit? So line 3 starts with the therefore. Therefore, and then to perfectly, therefore, then we come at the end to exchange completely. See that on the number 1, continue. Then we go back up to line 3 to exchange completely my own fixation on my own happiness for the sufferings of others. That's the subject, to exchange completely the fixation on my ego, my own ego-driven desire for happiness for the sufferings of all the beings in the world. And then we come back to line 4. Is the practice of the bodhisattva, going backwards on 2 and 3, is the practice of the bodhisattva. So there you go. Time is rushing by, but that's a rather quick tour of a Tibetan shloka. So you can't study Tibetan without learning about the Dharma. They're one and the same. The Dharma is the vehicle for the expression of the Dharma. So it's like form is emptiness and emptiness is form. The two fit together perfectly like that. The emptiness is the ultimate teaching of the Buddha, the Buddha's teaching that's in the verse that we just saw. And the form is the language. So they fit together beautifully like that. And then like all things that are beautiful, like a beautiful person, you might just see them one time and go, that's a beautiful person. And then you hear them speak and you go, that's a really beautiful person. And then you hear them speak compassionately and eloquently and then engage in positive deeds to help people around them. And you go, that's even a more beautiful person than I thought they were. So they keep becoming more beautiful. Very few people probably are like that, but you could take the Dalai Lama for an example. The Dalai Lama said he got this text, by the way, the Dalai Lama, the most famous of the Gelug teachers and practitioners, he got this teaching from a man who wasn't even Tibetan, and that man got it from the head of the Dzogchen monastery in Tibet. So the Dalai Lama has transcended all the lineages and learns from everybody and teaches and loves everyone. So a great exemplar for all of us, I think. But anyway, that's my little ordinary guy attempt to reading something that's sublime and beautiful and sharing a bit of it with you. So I hope that's been interesting and helpful, and maybe for a few of you even inspiring. And I hope you will follow up from today and take classes with us and explore some more of this beautiful, beautiful language and profound and philosophically and deeply meaningful spiritual language and the spiritual teachings, which is the culture of Tibet. Okay, so I think we have time for a bit of Q&A now. And Deanna will be contacting you with an email and telling you about, as Benta previewed and summarized, some of our upcoming things. But we have a marvelous website with many, many things like this, and the very famous Refuge in Bodhicitta or Bodhicitta prayer, Refuge in Heart of Awakening prayer. I've analyzed that in the same way, and it's on the website. Okay, let's have some Q&A if we have some. And while we're getting that going, I want to thank Deanna for putting the whole class together in terms of all, rounding up everybody and helping them register and be here today. I want to thank all of you who've come, and then Benta and George, who are constantly extremely helpful on all these little projects that we do. This has been fun. Okay, I'll stop talking. And George, we have some Q.
Hello, we do have some Q. Do you have some A? First question comes from Dario, who asks about Duknyal, suffering. Is the Duk part, the first syllable, the sa da da shapu du ga duk, is that related to dukkha in Sanskrit, which means suffering or sin defect or something like that?
Yeah, when I first studied Tibetan, I learned that, and I remembered from my Sanskrit study days that, and I had the very same question. I think it's just coincidental. So I don't think it's related. I think it's just coincidental. Duk in Tibetan is a mysterious word that sometimes can mean its opposite, but in this context, it means unpleasant or frustration. And then nel means pain. And then they put the two together to mean suffering. But that's a cool question. Thank you for that question. But it's just my opinion. I'm not an expert, but I think it's just coincidental.
Okay. And then Dario also points out that Japanese also has the verb at the end of a sentence, just like Tibetan.
Cool.
David H. asks, is there a traditional melody that accompanies the recitation of a text like this? Or
there are a lot of different monasteries have their different melodies and their different ways of singing. So I don't think there's one standard one. It would vary from place to place. And it's so common that you can actually find people singing it online. I don't know where exactly, but I have in the past come across that.
Okay. Next question comes from Carolyn, who asks, if in verse the main verb is in line 4, in parsing, would one go to line 4 first for the main verb and then go back to line 1 and continue with your translating?
That's not a bad idea. Yes. Sometimes, sometimes there's subordinate verbs at the end of line 2 is a common place for them. But we had a couple of verbs in this one, but that's not a horrible idea, because then you get the main verb, which is kind of like the fulcrum of the whole 4-line shloka. One of my teachers, when I studied Greek, would say, just take it as it comes. And then later in the same day, I would have a class from the other guy, and he would say, go to the verb first, and we know what's going on. So it's different style of people, but I would embrace that. If you wanted to do that, I would think that was a good idea.
Alrighty. Betsy asks, please explain why wouldn't you study Sanskrit instead of Tibetan?
Oh, actually, and as a Buddhist practitioner, what the Tibetans did with the Sanskrit language is extremely beautiful. With their understanding of the teachings, they were working with Sanskrit scholars from India together for centuries, but in the beginning, in crafting this language, they did something completely amazing. So ideally, one would study both of them, but in a way, Tibetan is more important because of that living tradition of practicing, and then the language making the language one with the teachings for the very purpose of conveying the teachings, and then doing that for 1,300 years. Then we inherit that as students of Tibetan. So it's a very powerful. I would love to return to study Sanskrit, and anyone that wants to study Sanskrit, I would tip my hat to. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing to do. But for the Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, Tibetan is more important. And then as soon as you get that, then go get Sanskrit too. And the Japanese, by the way, since Japan came up, I talked a couple of times there, maybe Japan is the scholars from Japan are the world's greatest scholars of Tibetan, outside the Tibetans themselves. And they've done beautiful things, and a lot of it they've done in English and translated in English and preserved a lot of other people's translations in beautiful editions, and they've done beautiful scholarship. And so, for instance, if you are in Buddhist studies in graduate school at Columbia, and you're focusing on Tibetan Buddhism, you have to take a year of Japanese just so you can read some of that great work. That's just a side tip of the hat for Japanese. If you know Japanese.
All right. Next question comes from Caitlin, who asks, does sa rata sa sa say apply to both male and female children?
Yes, thanks for asking.
It says just son honorific.
Yes, thanks for asking that question. I didn't complete what I wanted to say about it, and that's one of the things I wanted to mention. Say is an honorific word for offspring. And so it's neither feminine nor masculine. And the word gelse for Bodhisattva, but then it shows up a lot by itself, just say. It's either or either masculine or feminine. So a bodhisattva is not necessarily female or male, it's either one or both. Good question. Many translators would translate it with masculine pronouns, of course, for a long time, and we're trying to change that.
Okay, I think that's all the questions we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning in, folks, and we hope to see you in one of our classes at some point.
Okay. Thanks, George. Thanks a million, George. Thanks, Benta, again. Thank you all very much. I see we had some 50 or so people came to the talk today. So it was a little speedy and covered a lot of ground in a short hour, but again, I hope you enjoyed it and learned something from it. And then also, as Benta mentioned, you'll be able to watch it again if you like over the next month. Okay, so I hope you'll join us in the future, and stay safe, be well, be happy. As the Tibetans say, well, first of all, Tuji Che, that's thank you, but it translates as Tuk is heart, and J is noble. So noble-hearted, and Tukche Che, and Che is great. So you have no great noble-heartedness. Anyway, that's how they say thank you. And you have great compassion. So on the one hand, Tuje Che, on the other, Tashi Deli. And Tashi means auspicious, De means bliss or happiness, and Lek means excellent. So may everything be auspicious for you, blissful and happy and excellent. And I hope we can study together down the line. Okay, thank you very, very much. Happy trails. Bye-bye.